And our next speaker is Alex Madva from California State Polytechnic University, and his talk is called Responsibility for Interpreting Implicit Bias. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, everybody. Okay, so some of you may be wondering why I have a boot on my foot, and it's because I've been busy drop-kicking oppression. Understanding and overcoming implicit bias is a full contact sport, so brace yourselves because this is going to get intense. Okay, so I got to fly through this if I want to get done in 30 minutes. So some aims for the talk. One is to better understand the psychological nature of implicit bias, and another is to do so in part by situating implicit bias in embodied minds and social contexts. And ultimately, the direction where this is headed, although I really won't have a ton of time to talk about it today, is to kind of draw out some of the implications of this descriptive view of implicit bias for thinking about questions of individual and collective responsibility. Alyssa earlier was talking about Jules Holroyd's distinction between having implicit bias and manifesting implicit bias and acting on the knowledge of implicit bias. And this might be, what's going to be implicated is potentially all three of those are implicated, or it might be a kind of fourth domain where what we are responsible for in part is interpreting our own attitudes as accurately and justly as possible. Okay, so Katerina went through the implicit association test, so I won't give a big review of it again now. Right? People tend to have an easier time associating white with good and black with bad. People have an easier time associating thin with good and fat with bad. People have an easier time associating Americans do anyway, European American names and faces with American locations, like this is the Golden Gate Bridge, and Asian American names and faces with foreign locations, including the Eiffel Tower. Americans tend to have an easier time associating white faces with harmless objects like flashlights and black faces with a known object of the ghetto, the battle axe. One of the questions then that has preoccupied both implicit bias researchers as well as some critics of implicit bias is what exactly are we measuring in these sorts of contexts? So something like the received view has been that we're measuring mere associations between concepts. So in the same way that when you think of salt, you think of pepper. When you think of apple, you think of orange. When you think of doctor, you think of nurse. When you think black, you think weapon, right? Another sort of way to bring out the association idea, I think this comes from Susanna Siegel, is something like this. When I say hop, you say hip. When I say flop, you say... Okay, that was pretty pathetic, but you're anywhere. Right, so it's the way in which those concepts are priming each other, right? However, a raft of studies has come out in the past 10 years or so, suggesting that the things that we're measuring on these, things like the implicit association test and other indirect measures, are perhaps more full-blown beliefs, emotions, or even values. So as philosophers like to say, propositions with a kind of language-like structure. Even if that view is correct, even if we are measuring beliefs, there's a further question, which is, which beliefs? So take, for example, the black weapon bias, right? What beliefs is that picking up on? Is it perhaps picking up on the belief that blacks are often violent, that blacks often commit weapon-related violence? Or is it perhaps the belief that blacks are often stereotyped as violent? Or indeed, is it the belief that blacks are often victims of weapon-related violence? Any one of those beliefs could potentially explain a greater likelihood of associating black with weapons on the IAT. Okay, to put this in kind of a more folksy context, let's say you're meeting a member of a different racial group or another kind of salient social group for the first time, and you feel some kind of negative, uncomfortable gut feeling. Is that because you are afraid of the racial other? Or are you perhaps just afraid of appearing racist? Or are you perhaps feeling guilty about your complicity in racial oppression? The story that I'm going to be telling today it's complicated, and as a matter of fact, it's an indeterminate in general whether any of those answers is the correct one. So there's no general determinate answer to the question about which specific attitudes we're picking up on, which is to say that we're not just measuring mere associations between concepts, but we're also not measuring fully articulated, propositionally structured beliefs and emotions. I think the mental contents of implicit bias are fundamentally indeterminate. And today I'm going to sort of move back and forth between describing them as vague or ambiguous or coarse-grained or open-textured. I know there's a bunch of metaphysicians here and linguists, and so if you want to come at me about vagueness, let's do it in the Q&A for sure. Nevertheless, even though I think biases are considered in themselves in isolation indeterminate, I think they become determinate in context, where the context includes your other attitudes, your other traits, your other goals, your other values and beliefs, as well as stuff outside of you, including social norms, power relations, and so on. Basically what is, I think, sort of falls out of that is these implications for responsibility, where because these attitudes have a very up-for-grabs kind of character, then that introduces this further dimension of responsibility, which is that we are each individually responsible for interpreting our own and others' biases in the most accurate and just ways possible. And we're collectively responsible for trying to foster environments and structure social institutions in ways that encourage the accurate and virtuous interpretations and discourage the vicious ones. Okay, so a picture that I'm going to come back to a lot is Waddington's 1942 picture of the epigenetic landscape. This was originally meant to represent the way that genes can express themselves differently depending on environmental influences. So it's like you have a gene at the top of the ball, at the top is the gene, and then different environmental influences are these different crevices here. And so the ball can sort of fall down into different paths depending on what's going on in your environment. And so similarly, I'm going to say that implicit bias is like the ball at the top of the hill, and then how we act and how we think about our biases is going to be the stuff at the bottom of the hill. So where environmental influences and other things going on in our minds shape the content of implicit bias. So this is if I was not wearing my contacts or my glasses and I was in getting my eyes examined in the US, this is what the eye chart would look like to me. And so what you have are, sort of blurry looking letters, right? So let's take that letter, for example. What letter is that? Well, look, it might be an F, it might be a P, okay? It's definitely not an E or a Z, right? And so what we have is a kind of context where there are a range of possible answers for what that letter is. Some of them are more likely or central or focal, such as it being an F or a P. Some are less likely. And then some are just entirely off the table, right? So there's this kind of open-ended, but at the same time limited range of possible interpretations of that figure. And so in the paper, I spent a lot of time building up this view by reference to the phenomenological and hermeneutic concepts of horizons of interpretation, where there's like a text or something like that, where there's a range of possible interpretations. Some of them are more natural, some of them are kind of on the border of plausible, and then others are outside that domain entirely. I think some of the most replicable examples of indeterminacy like this are actually auditory. So there's a famous line from Aretha Franklin's rendering of Respect, R-E-S-P-E-C-T, find out what it means to me, R-E-S-P-E-C-T, where nobody knows what the lyric is. I looked it up on Genius because I'm using it as an example. Does anybody know what the lyric is? It's actually Take Care TCB. TCB stands for Taking Care of Business. Anyway, so that's the line, but nobody knows what it is. And it just sort of has this kind of vague, blurry sound to it, right? Another example, my father originally heard the Beatles song Lady Madonna as knee-deep in donuts. That's what he thought the lyric was. Now, I've never actually heard it that way, but it's sort of close enough to the actual lyric that you can kind of like, if you listen to it, Paul McCartney's voice is pretty muffled when he says it if you go back and listen to it, so it's sort of a plausible interpretive mistake. It's kind of in the ballpark of plausible interpretations. So what's going to shape the ways that we sort of fix on particular determinate interpretations of these indeterminate phenomena are going to be features related to our context, right? So for example, let's say you're in a context where you're looking at lots of cute bunnies that are looking longingly into each other's eyes, right? So here we have two more bunnies that are looking longingly into each other's eyes. Oh, wait. Or is it actually two ducks who don't want to have anything to do with each other? Okay, so these are sort of more elaborate versions of the duck-rabbit figure, right, where you can sort of see it in one of two ways. I primed you to put you in the context of seeing them as bunnies, but I could have put you in a different context where you would see them as ducks. Right, so it's like, here's your duck-rabbit figure, and then depending on context, maybe you live in a world where there are only ducks and no rabbits, or you live in a world where there are only rabbits and no ducks. Depending on your context, the ball might fall to the left, and then you see it as a duck, and depending on context, it might fall to the right, and you see it as, that's Marlon Bundo, that's the bunny rabbit of the Pence family in the White House. Okay. In some cases, context plays such a powerful role that it literally constructs something out of nothing. So on the left here, all we have is this collection of shapes, but nevertheless, we see it as, one square on top of another square, right? There's literally nothing there, but we see it in a certain way because of contextual features. Similarly here, we just have a bunch of these splotches. There's no actual Necker cube there, but because of context, we see a kind of fully constructed Necker cube in the figure. So that's sort of some of the background ideas for how I'm thinking about this indeterminacy stuff, and kind of shifting gears towards cases more related to implicit bias. Some of you might be seeing a wallet when you look at that particular image, but others of you might actually be seeing something like a gun, okay? So part of what might be going on in cases where unarmed black men are killed by the police is that they're holding one of those harmless looking objects, but officers either see it or interpret it as a weapon of some kind, right? So some of the research that gets at this idea, this is a paper from 2011, and there were a couple different variables. Participants' job was to identify the race of the person that they're looking at. And there was a couple different variables. So first, the person was either wearing a janitor's suit or a business suit. So this is the janitor's suit down here or a business suit up here. And then the person they're looking at was either pale white or clearly black or of an ambiguous race in between. Okay? And their participants' job was to identify the race of the individual as either white or black. And what they found was that, especially for these ambiguous figures in the middle, that when that person was wearing a janitor's suit, they were identified as black, and when they were wearing a business suit, they were identified as white. So the very same face is categorized as a different race based off of contextual cues, in this case related to clothing and status. In fact, they even sort of monitored people's hand movements while they were doing the task, and they found that even for the pale white guy wearing a janitor's suit, there was an initial impulse to categorize him as black, and then they sort of self-corrected and moved it to the white box afterwards. Okay? So in this case, ambiguous race is the sort of indeterminate or vague part of experience, and then contextual cues about status and who's more likely to have which jobs shapes our interpretation. So what's going on here is we have these kind of felt but perhaps not noticed background cues that are affecting our judgment about what's in the foreground. However, we also know from all these perceptual studies that what we perceive to be foreground and background can actually shift. So with the Necker cube, you can famously see it either, the foreground and background can shift. With this figure, you can either see it as white faces against a black background or a black vase against a white background, right? And similarly, they have switched foreground and background in these studies looking at perceptual judgments about people's race. So in this study, in the first one, they had videos of the faces are structurally identical, but they have Afrocentric or Eurocentric features. And they were videos where the faces were changing gradually from determinately happy, clearly happy, to more angry faces. And a participant's job was to say, at which exact moment did the face then go from being happy to angry or angry to happy, right? So that you're looking at these faces, and the question you're trying to ask is this face angry or sad? Sorry, I should say angry or happy. And what they found was that again, people were more likely to say that people were more likely to jump the gun with the black guy and say, okay, his face is now determinately angry, where the very same facial expression as the white guy would be interpreted as still ambiguous, not clearly angry. And they also found in this case that participants' implicit biases predicted this tendency. but not their explicit biases. So participants who were more implicitly biased against black people were more likely to see the ambiguous black face as angry. Now, a follow-up study was a similar one to the one I just described, where again they were looking at faces, but the faces were ambiguously raced, and the faces either had happy expressions or angry expressions. And participants' job was to categorize the race, right? And again, they found that the very same face, in terms of skin tone, would be more likely to be categorized as white if it was happy, and as black if it was angry. And again, they found that that tendency was predicted by implicit bias. So in these cases, implicit bias is itself one of the kind of background cues that we're drawing on to interpret otherwise indeterminate or ambiguous aspects of our perceptual experience, right? So it's one of the things, it's, in a sense, it's like a skill that we draw on for moving from contextual cues to resolving indeterminacies in what we experience. And I put skills in scare quotes because, on the one hand, these are clearly socially learned tendencies. We do pick them up from the world. On the other hand, they're obviously biased and sometimes tragically so. So what I want to do next is kind of shift from implicit bias, thinking of implicit bias as one of these background features that's shaping our interpretation of particular things, to putting implicit bias in the foreground, right? What is the actual content of implicit biases? And the suggestion is going to be that in the same way that someone's facial expression or their race could be indeterminate or vague, implicit biases are also indeterminate. Ultimately, I think the right view to have is a kind of holistic one where all of these different factors in play are shaping each other. So your perception of a person's race shapes your perception of their emotion. Your perception of their emotion can actually affect your implicit biases, and your implicit biases affects the race perception and so on. One way that this is put in one of the papers that I'll be talking about later is that implicit affect toward outgroups serves as an ambiguous signal that is available to be conceptualized as different discrete emotions based on the context. Okay, so that's where I'm headed eventually. A final prefatory note before I get there. Implicit biases are conscious. Despite the sort of prevailing narratives about them, the research increasingly suggests, and much of the research that I'll talk about today, pretty much only makes sense on the assumption that whatever we're measuring on these implicit association tests is conscious. Sometimes there's this sort of gut feelings that can be felt but not noticed, or they can be noticed or interpreted in weird ways, but nevertheless they're sort of there as part of our experience available for interpretation. You might think here of the phenomenon of being hangry. Actually, you're hungry, but because you're hungry, that leads you to, for example, get angry at another person. And so you're conscious of your hunger. If you consult your stomach or something like that, you'll feel that pang there, right? But nevertheless, that leads you to, for example, become angry at somebody else, where you're sort of misinterpreting your own feelings as anger at another person. To say that implicit bias is conscious, I don't mean to say that they're transparently accessible to introspection. I don't think any of our attitudes is transparently accessible to introspection. But the idea is that they're no less accessible than some of the more prototypically explicit attitudes. And in fact, I think you'll see that kind of the standard ways of understanding the relationship between implicit and explicit have to change. Ultimately, whether we self-report and act on our implicit biases doesn't depend so much on the content of the biases themselves as it does on a big bunch of other factors. Okay, so first version of this, first sort of set of studies that get at this, we're operating with the theory that implicit biases are what they called immediate affective reactions, or more colloquially, gut feelings of like or dislike. So you're meeting someone for the first time and you have a kind of spontaneous affective reaction, a vibe or something you might call it, and that's the sort of gut feeling that is consciously accessible. Their hypothesis in this paper was that people often fail to report their negative gut feelings, not because they're unconscious, but because the implications of those gut feelings conflict with their other beliefs, values, and so on. And so they're operating in this case in a kind of cognitive dissonance and cognitive consistency framework. So the basic sort of structure that many Americans find themselves in is represented this way. So first, people have a negative affective reaction to black people, let's say. And that's sort of your gut feeling, that's your implicit bias. And on their view, that other things equal, having that implicit bias would lead you to form the belief or to self-ascribe or make the utterance, I dislike black people. However, that attitude, I dislike black people, is inconsistent. And here we're talking about psychological inconsistency, not logical inconsistency. So I need you to dial down the philosophical precision o-meter for a second here. Disliking black people or making negative evaluations of black people is inconsistent with these two other sort of broad classes of beliefs. One of them is that black people represent a disadvantaged minority group. This is the kind of more beliefy area where it's like your beliefs about what oppression and racism in the world are like. And the other one is that negative evaluations of members of disadvantaged minority groups are wrong. So if you believe that having negative attitudes towards members of disadvantaged groups is wrong, and you believe that black people represent a disadvantaged minority group, that's going to be inconsistent with this attitude of disliking black people. So there are different ways of resolving this inconsistency. You could sort of give up any one of these three items. So in the kind of classic old-fashioned prejudice context, what they change is the belief that negative evaluations of disadvantaged groups is wrong. They think perhaps that black people are actually inferior or threats to their way of life or something like that, such that having those negative attitudes is okay. So those individuals have an effect on this view, set up a kind of direct line of communication between their implicit gut feelings and their explicit attitudes because of that belief. Now, a kind of more modern prejudiced or racist perspective nominally holds on to the idea that having negative evaluations of members of disadvantaged groups is wrong. You hold on to that idea. But now you deny that black people actually represent a disadvantaged minority group. That was a thing of the past. We got rid of slavery. We ended segregation and so on. It's not a problem anymore, right? And so those individuals, too, will be able to hold on to the idea that they'll make their implicit biases will lead them to say things like, I dislike black people. In this case, the negative evaluations might be things like condescension or blaming people's disadvantage on their bad choices or cultural pathologies or something like that, as opposed to blaming it on oppression. However, many of us will instead find ourselves giving up a different proposition, namely this one down here. So if you hold on to the idea that negative evaluations of disadvantaged minority groups is wrong, and that black people represent a disadvantaged minority group, then you will, rather than reporting the sort of direct implications of your gut feeling, you will deny that that gut feeling represents your attitudes, and you'll say, I like black people and white people the same, or something like that. So the standard way of describing implicit bias is this framework right here, where people have the conscious good attitudes and the unconscious bad attitudes, right? But this way of understanding it doesn't put it on consciousness and unconsciousness at all. So what aversive racists are doing on this view is something like this. If you're motivated to fight against, already 5 minutes? No way. Half an hour? Yeah. No way. 3:20. All right, okay, so I'll just... 3 minutes late. Yeah, so more minutes. Yeah. So 8 minutes total? Yeah. Okay, I'll just bounce around a little bit. Okay. All right, so some other studies have looked at other ways of taking our implicit biases and turning them into explicit biases. So one study, actually several studies, first had people complete a measure of their implicit biases. In this case, it was straight white couples versus gay white couples and whether they thought they were positive or negative. Then afterwards, one group of participants was told, you may have had a gut feeling towards the pictures of heterosexuals and homosexuals. Research has found this gut feeling usually reflects people's genuine attitude towards homosexuality. So this group is told that gut feeling that you had while you were completing this measure, that's the real you, that's what you're really about, okay? Subsequently, they completed an explicit questionnaire about their attitudes toward gay people and their beliefs about policies that affect gay people. And this group of participants was more likely to oppose gay marriage and military enrollment, right? So this is a kind of ownership manipulation where they're led to think these are my own beliefs, these are my real attitude, and that effectively turned implicit bias into explicit bias. So there's a kind of irony here for some people who talk about implicit bias and responsibility, like Angela Smith and Eric Schwitzgable, think we ought to take ownership of our biases in order to take responsibility for transforming them. Other folks, such as our very own Robin Zhang, have suggested that maybe attributing biases to people might be problematic. Prima facie, this seems to have a similar sort of result. Another group of participants, however, was told, you may have had a gut feeling towards the pictures of heterosexuals and homosexuals. Research has found that this gut feeling usually does not reflect people's genuine attitude towards homosexuality. Now, this group of participants was more likely to support gay marriage and military enrollment. So they say, that gut feeling, that's not the real you, that's not what you're really about. In other words, how we think about our biases affects how we act, right? How our biases influence our judgment and action. One kind of implication here is that these are clear object lessons about the power of norms and authority figures, right? So in this case, we have psychology professors saying, this is what the research tells us, or something, right? But of course, the same lesson would probably also be true for parents, for religious leaders, for political leaders who come along and say, that gut feeling, that's the real you, you should trust that. Another note, however, is that there was no effect of this manipulation on individuals who did not demonstrate implicit biases. So here's a way to inoculate yourself against this kind of demagogic rhetorical maneuver, which is eliminate your biases altogether. I'm going to talk about the two studies that I think really bring home the indeterminacy point that I was trying to build towards. So in the first study in this paper from 2017, participants completed an AMP, which is the affect misattribution procedure. It's similar to the IAT in that it purports to measure people's implicit attitudes. And then they answered a series of questions about their explicit emotions towards black people. And what they found was none of these specific discrete emotions reach statistical significance in terms of correlating with people's implicit biases. So if you had the implicit bias, there was no particular negative emotion that you were more likely to report. What they did find, however, was that if you had implicit biases, you were more likely to say one of these negative emotions rather than one of the positive emotions. So there's this kind of vague negative, so, you're more likely to say something negative when I ask you what your feelings are about black people, right? It might be, I'm angry towards them. It might be, I feel guilty about racial oppression or something like that, right? But it's got a negative valence, okay? The study that I think best brings home the kind of indeterminacy point that I was talking about, however, in this case, again, they completed, it has the same structure, very similar structure to the ones I was describing a moment ago. First, people complete measures of their implicit reactions to white versus black faces. Then one group of participants is told, research has demonstrated that white Americans commonly hold negative associations with blacks compared to whites. Empirical evidence suggests that these negative associations are often due to feelings of fear because of beliefs about the status of blacks in American society. Please generate 2 or 3 reasons why any negative feelings you may have felt toward black faces might reflect fear of African Americans. Okay, so I tell you that it's fear, and then I ask you to come up with reasons why it's fear. And then they completed an explicit questionnaire. And now participants were willing to openly admit that they would agree with statements like, blacks are scary, blacks are threatening. Okay. Interestingly, they also had, after this manipulation, in some cases, they also completed a perceptual task, which was again looking at faces and that had ambiguous emotional expressions. And they found that implicitly biased participants who were told that their bias was fear were more likely to see the ambiguous black face as angry. In other words, thinking back on those perceptual studies that I was talking about earlier, there's not actually a one-to-one correlation. If you have the implicit bias, then you see the face as angry. That's actually mediated by how you interpret the implicit bias, right? In some cases, they just measure people's, whether you think it's fear or not, rather than manipulating it, and you find the same pattern. So there's some level of indeterminacy in our attitudes. Nevertheless, the same study also found that the range of possible interpretations of our implicit biases was limited. So in another condition, they were told, these negative associations are often due to feelings of sympathy because of beliefs about the status of blacks in American society, right? So instead of being told fear, they're told sympathy. Now, what they found was that these participants did not report that they were afraid of African Americans, but nor did they actually report that they felt sympathy toward African Americans. So what we have is some level of indeterminacy. You can have either fear or not fear, but it's not just that anything goes. So there's certain sorts of radically constructionist or existentialist views where the mind can sort of come up with anything. Those are also off the table. So our metacognition, our self-interpretation matters, but the range of plausible interpretations of our biases is nevertheless fundamentally limited. So whereas someone said, just beyond the horizon of the so-called impossible is infinite possibility, we'd say, no, false, that's wrong. There are clear limits on feasible interpretations. So the question is not just whether you report your implicit biases, but literally what it is that you're reporting when you report them. The content itself is, I think, absent a whole bunch of other contextual features, indeterminate and up for grabs. There's some range of flexibility, so fear and not fear are both in the ballpark of plausible self-interpretations of bias. In that particular study, they couldn't get the sympathy manipulation, but in the Q&A we can talk about other studies where sympathy does seem to correlate with implicit biases. So that suggests that it's kind of on the border between central and kind of off-the-table interpretations. Other interpretations will clearly be off the table, such as joy. Nobody's going to interpret their implicit bias towards an outgroup as joy. I'm probably out of time.
I guess we can go for a couple of more.
Okay. So right before I sent around the paper, I came across further studies adding further wrinkles to the complexities here. So earlier I talked about the genuine attitude manipulation, the ownership manipulation, and it seemed to suggest that people who are told that their attitudes reflect their genuine selves become explicitly biased. Actually, there's more complication. There's other factors going on in people's minds that matter. So they found that there were diverging effects of the ownership manipulation for implicit bias people who were high versus low in the internal motivation to be unprejudiced. That is, people who say that they're personally committed to fighting against racism, to not being prejudiced. So people who were low in being motivated to be unprejudiced and had implicit biases and were told that their implicit biases represented their genuine selves, those folks were more likely to report explicit biases and also engage in a kind of measure of discrimination, which was how much money to donate to a black nonprofit compared to another nonprofit. However, participants who were high in the motivation to be unprejudiced and had implicit biases and were led to think of their implicit biases as their own, to attribute them to themselves, to take ownership for them, showed less discrimination. Right. So even the effects of this ownership manipulation can have major differences to how you actually go on to act in the world. There's a whole bunch of other studies that find that in some contexts, implicit biases are correlated with positive and potentially even virtuous intergroup behavior. Because basically it seems like some individuals learn to interpret their negative gut feelings as perhaps guilt and as perhaps an opportunity to do the right thing. So it's like normally you have this like biased impulse to, whatever it is, laugh at an off-color joke, and then you feel that impulse and you're aware of that, and then you kind of interpret that as an opportunity to do the right thing. I think the implications for this for thinking about responsibility, my sense is that taking this view about indeterminism encourages certain, sort of widening our understanding of implicit bias in certain ways. So the fact is that the fact that we have these biases means that there's the potential to guide us toward both just and unjust action, depending on a whole bunch of other factors in our minds and our environments. Which means that each of us is individually responsible for interpreting, reining in, and ultimately eradicating our implicit biases, as well as holding other people accountable for doing the same. And we're also collectively responsible for structuring social environments that, among other things, this is the last slide, that encourage accurate and virtuous self-interpretations and discourage the vicious ones, right? So that's it.
Okay.